Today, flooding by design. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Just before I start, a quick reminder that at 8 p.m. Sydney tonight, we'll be running our next live show, and Damien Klassen from Nucleus Wealth will be on to talk about the latest with regard to the financial markets both locally and overseas. And given what's going on at the moment, that will be a very important show. So we look forward to seeing you tonight at 8 p.m. Sydney time. Banks are set to offer disaster relief to their customers after devastating floods hit New South Wales, according to Australian broker. All of the big four banks have offered a range of options to their members who are caught up in flooding that has been described as some of the worst seen in Australia for a generation. Areas across New South Wales have been battered by record rainfall, with rivers bursting their banks in coastal areas and parts of Western Sydney. Once the cleanup begins, it's important for people to know that they can talk to their bank to seek assistance, said Australian Banking Association CEO Anna Bligh. The message from banks is clear. Don't tough it out on your own. Your bank is ready to help. In particular, those who've suffered during the floods will be able to receive loan repayment deferrals, fee waivers, debt consolidations, and refinancing. And many of those affected by the floods are the same people who have suffered in recent years with other natural disasters such as droughts and bushfires, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And in response to the floods, the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, AFCA, has activated its Significant Event Response Plan, which is designed to combat the number of complaints that arise when natural disasters strike. AFCA acted after the Insurance Council of Australia declared a floods catastrophe, a crucial move in defining how the financial industry reacts to major natural disasters. As a result of the ICA's call, insurance claims related to the floods will now be prioritised, and property owners within the affected areas will have more recourse to support from their banks and insurers. It's too early to understand the extent of the damage to property in the affected areas and to estimate the insurance damage bill. However, insurers have received more than 5,000 claims in the past few days, said Andrew Hall, the CEO of the ICA. The insurance industry has made this catastrophe declaration to activate services and support for affected house owners and businesses to ensure that their insurer is there to help. As many areas are currently inaccessible due to floodwater, insurers are expecting further claims in coming days as emergency services allow residents to return to their properties to examine the extent of their damage and losses. Now, the ABC highlights that the humble bathtub holds the key to explaining Sydney's flood danger. Australia's largest city is often described as being in the Sydney Basin, particularly apt actually right now, as it's experiencing something known as the Bathtub Effect. It's what's happening when a lot of water is tipping into low-lying areas like Sydney, and it can't escape quickly enough. When it rains, the water that's dumped on the ground eventually drains into rivers and ultimately into the ocean. If a lot of rain is trying to escape from somewhere at the same time, low-lying areas can fill up like a bathtub, while the deluge makes its way through one small point, like a plug hole. Sydney is surrounded by three rivers, the Hawkesbury to the north, the Nepean to the west, and the Georges to the south. The abundance of water, of course, is one of the things that makes the harbour city such a desirable place to live. But when it rains a lot in a very short space of time, or steadily for several days, the rivers sometimes struggle to cope. Authorities are particularly concerned about suburbs along the Nepean and Hawkesbury rivers. They actually connect to each other to form part of the same system. And Tom Hubble from Sydney University, who studied the area extensively, says the catchment that feeds the Hawkesbury Nepean river system extends well beyond Greater Sydney. It encompasses a great deal of the Blue Mountains and much of the Southern Highlands all the way out to Goulburn. There's a large part of the catchment that feeds into the rivers around Sydney that people aren't that familiar with, he said. Much of it is wild country, national parks and forests with deep valleys and steep slopes, which leads to rapid runoff. When a lot of water descends into the area, it makes its way to the ocean really quite quickly in 2 or 3 days. Professor Hubble says the Cumberland Plain area between the Blue Mountains and Parramatta was a natural depression in the landscape which formed very slowly over the past 100 million years. It's not like it can drop down a metre all of a sudden, but over geological time it has sunk a little lower than the surrounding areas, he said. This has created a situation where the Nepean River Valley between Penrith and Sackville is a little bit like a bathtub. All of the water flowing out of the catchment has to exit to the sea through that depression. But then the inundation of houses and businesses in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley of Western Sydney is tragic for the people affected, but it is, or should be, no surprise. The losses are due to inept government, not to any act of God, so says Professor Jamie Pittock in an opinion piece in the SMH. Dangerous floods in the valley are not new. On April the 4th, 1817, Governor Macquarie lamented it is impossible not to feel extremely displeased at settlers' infatuated obstinacy in persisting and continuing to reside with their families, flocks, herds and grain on those spots subject to the floods and from whence they have often had their prosperity swept away. The valley now presents a high risk to 70,000 residents as physical choke points along the river channel, such as the Sackville Gorge, bank up and slow the discharge of large floods into the sea. In modern Australia, we expect our governments to apply expert knowledge in regulations and other programs to reduce excessive danger to citizens, but such good governance has been lacking in the valley. Unfortunately, there are now 5,000 homes in the valley built below the 1 in 100-year flood level, and a further 7,000 lie under the 1 in 500-year flood level. The Premier reported on Sunday that the current rain is predicted to be only a 1 in a 50-year event in the Hawkesbury Nepean, although a 1 in a 100-year event on the mid-north coast. The dangers of more frequent large floods are increasing with a changing climate, making government action to reduce risk more urgent. Now, the New South Wales government's silver bullet solution to manage flood risk is to raise Warragamba Dam to hold flood peaks. The global experience is that flood control infrastructure increases dangers and losses by encouraging more downstream development that is then inundated as design limits are inevitably breached by a large flood. Unbelievably, the state government plans to allow around 134,000 more people to settle in harm's way on the floodplain by 2050. Further, raising Warragamba Dam will not prevent the frequent flood damage from tributaries entering the valley below the dam, including the Gross River and South Creek. Raising the dam would also inundate cultural sites and part of the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. In the 1990s, countries such as China and the Netherlands realised that the best risk reduction is to restore floodplains to give rivers room to flood safely by moving people and sensitive infrastructure out of harm's way. At places such as Geus Point in the Netherlands, these restored floodplains are now the basis of thriving local economies based on agriculture, recreation and nature conservation. The New South Wales government should abandon its dam raising plan and stop allowing new developments in harm's way. Regulators should not allow flood-destroyed infrastructure to be rebuilt as it was. A long-term program is needed to help the most flood-prone residents and businesses to resettle on safe land. Such programs have been undertaken successfully elsewhere in Australia, most notably the relocation of the town of Grantham following the 2011 Brisbane River flood. The government should also reinvigorate stalled plans to rebuild evacuation roads that currently are cut by the smallest floods, leaving residents stranded. It could also increase floodwater holding capacity now by partly emptying the existing Warragamba Dam with greater resilience on desalination for Sydney's water supply. There are no simple or cheap solutions to reducing the risk to life and property from floods in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley. Dangerous floods are inevitable, and the safest option is to keep people off the floodplain, out of harm's way. Indeed, Elizabeth Mossop, Dean of Design, Architecture and Building, University of Technology, in the conversation goes further. As the current New South Wales flooding highlights, it is not enough to continue to build cities and towns based on business-as-usual planning principles, especially as these disasters tend to disproportionately affect disadvantaged populations, increasing inequality in Australia. We need to design our urban spaces around the idea that flooding is inevitable. That means not building on floodplains and thinking creatively about what can be done to create urban sinks to hold water when floods strike. It beggars belief, she says, this needs to be said, but it is a government responsibility to keep citizens out of harm's way. The ongoing plans for new housing in flood-prone areas, such as the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley, directly contravene that. Understanding urban flooding requires us to contend with the underlying natural systems over which we have built our cities and towns. We have learnt the hard way we cannot effectively design out flooding. Instead, we must find ways to work with the natural systems of drainage and catchments. We must create urban systems to accommodate floodwaters. That reduces risk to houses, schools, hospitals, businesses and other key infrastructure. We have tried channeling rivers with levees and flood walls, and it does not work. When those constructions fail, and they usually eventually do, the danger is immense. We need to find ways to safely allow rivers to expand in times of flood and to contract when the rains subside. This cycle of expansion and contraction is normal and natural for rivers. It is we humans that need to change. The cities of Rotterdam in the Netherlands and New Orleans in the United States are built on river deltas and are at a very high risk of flooding. The design strategy used by planners in these cities provide effective models for reducing flooding harm in Australia. Water management and climate adaptation should be factored into every urban plan and every project, large or small. Finally, I'm still amazed how few prospective property purchasers consult the publicly available flood maps for the area in which they're thinking of purchasing. Here is one example around Ryde in Sydney, showing first the local topology and then overlaid with the flood risks. The point is, risk is not uniform even within a given area, and if you drill down, you can even begin to look at local properties and landmarks. This is one thing everyone thinking of buying in lower lying areas should do. And not only is there the risk of property losses from flooding, but insurance premiums will be significantly higher, assuming flood protection is available at all, and in some areas it may not be. And there are always sad stories of people not being insured or not adequately being insured after such events. So prevention is absolutely better than cure. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.